Well, President Trump called for an end to special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation earlier today, calling it, quote, totally conflicted and discredited. That follows the release of heavily redacted documents this weekend related to federal surveillance of former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page because of his ties to Russia.
The president blamed the, quote, unverified and fake dirty dossier that was paid for by crooked Hillary Clinton and the DNC as the basis for the FBI tracking Page. Mr. Trump initially tried to capitalize on the release of the Bureau's FISA application, saying it proved the FBI misled the court. But lawmakers from both parties have disagreed with the president's assessment. Here's what Republican Senator Marco Rubio told CNN.
So as far as you know, and you're a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the surveillance was justified.
Yeah, I don't think they did anything wrong. I think they went to the court. They got the judges to approve it. They laid out all the information, and there was a lot of reasons unrelated to the dossier for why they wanted to look at Carter Page. And Carter Page was not a key member of the Trump campaign, and the Trump campaign has said that.
Ryan Goodman is a professor at New York University School of Law and a former special counsel at the Department of Defense. Good to see you, Professor. So Carter Page in 2013 called himself an informal advisor to the Kremlin, but now he says it would be over the top to refer to him that way. If the FBI had reason to believe that Carter Page was acting as an agent of Russia, why isn't he facing any charges?
So what's happening now is we're just talking in some sense about the FISA application to survey him, which is a counterintelligence measure and only has to satisfy this very low standard of a probable cause. Second question is, did he actually commit any crimes that would have a separate issue altogether? It'd be reviewed for whether or not Mueller could actually prove that beyond a reasonable doubt in court. You might also actually want to have somebody who is suspected to be a criminal roaming free, because if they're under surveillance, then for counterintelligence purposes, they're picking up a lot of valuable information. So there are multiple reasons as to why he wouldn't be charged, even though there'd be sufficient probable cause to believe that he's acting as an agent of the Kremlin.
So President Trump wanted to use the release of these documents to sort of discredit the Mueller investigation. You know, that the FISA warrant was improperly received or improperly approved of. Focusing on that dossier, you know, Republicans love to remind us often that the Democrats paid for the dossier. They don't like to remind us that Republicans were also instrumental in the initial commissioning of this dossier. But did the release of this heavily redacted document, did it do what the president is claiming that it did?
So it didn't. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican, yesterday said that it shows no wrongdoing on the part of the Justice Department. Also, this is a FISA application that's approved by 4 judges, each one over 90 days, which also means that they probably saw that the wiretap was picking up valuable information in order to renew it. It's also approved not only by the Obama Justice Department, but then by the Trump Justice Department. And it's not just the Steele dossier that's being utilized. There's a bunch of other information that's in there. We can't really tell as the public because it's all redacted. So it's hard for the president even to say, oh, it's all based on this one dossier. There's some indications of other information that the FBI had, including that they had interviewed Carter Page before he even joined the campaign, and they used the interviews in these documents that were released over the weekend. So it's a very hard claim to make that it's even improper, and even if it were improper, that it would impugn the Mueller investigation.
Right.
So given that the FISA court was aware that some of the sourcing came from the Steele dossier, but if you wanted to speculate and say that if the FISA court did not know what the origin or the provenance of the Steele dossier was, would that make the FBI's surveillance of Carter Page illegal?
It would maybe suggest that there's some question about the validity of it if that was hidden from the court.
But it wasn't, as we know. There was a footnote that was almost a page long.
That's right. So before this weekend, we all knew that there was a footnote, and now we actually know it's an entire page.
Right.
So it's like not your ordinary
footnote. And in the same font, which is not.
Right.
Again, people, when they think of footnotes, I mean, if people haven't seen the document, you can find it online. But footnotes generally people think of as being tiny print at the bottom of something. This is in the same font, and it goes on for a page. And
then the judge could ask them further questions. So they fully understood, the judges must have fully understood, they were fully informed of the provenance of this, that it was paid for in the context of somebody potentially trying to find out bad information about Donald Trump. But they also thought that the source itself was highly credible. This is a former British intelligence agent who has worked with the FBI before, who has informed the State Department before, who's utilizing the same sources that he had used before when he had produced valuable information for the U.S. government. So that's why the judges were able to assess the credibility, even though they understood that the provenance of this came from these kinds of political origins.
Does it at all, though, feed? What I'm trying to get a sense of is whether or not both parties can use the release of this document to their advantage, based on their separate narratives.
Democrats and Republicans.
Right.
Yeah, I think in some sense nobody can use the document. That's the way I try to think of it, in the way in which so much of the other information that the FBI presented to the court is redacted and blacked out. So how can anybody say what percentage was or wasn't? So that's what I think that's where I look for a lot of it being politicized. I do think that if you look at it with the fairest reading possible, the Nunes memo that was written about this material before we as a public got to see it ourselves doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So, for example, the Nunes memo said that the FBI did not tell the courts about the provenance of the Steele dossier. It's in there in a very big way. The Nunes memo suggested that the FBI used a newspaper article, a news report from Yahoo News, as corroboration. The Democratic response was that they didn't. This is also not a Democrat versus Republican issue. Senators Grassley and Graham also suggested that the Nunes memo was wrong about that. We now can see ourselves. That news report comes under a section. It's only used to show that Carter Page denied the allegations against him, not corroboration. And if anything, the FBI is also saying that the Yahoo News report is relying on the same information from Steele. So I do think there's some things that are a fair-minded reading of it would come out one way, but other parts of it are seemingly politicized and you can't really say anything about it.
The other thing that somebody with just any kind of sort of logical reasoning would surmise from what we're talking about here is that Carter Page, the warrant to surveil him, was renewed several times. It wasn't just a one-time thing. Somebody had to go to a judge and say, we have some suspicions about this individual and we need another warrant to continue to watch him, and that warrant was renewed.
That's right. It's
After
renewed.
the Trump administration was already in power.
It's right.
That's right. So the first one, the warrant is granted in October and then renewed every 90 days. You do the math, and then the last one would be July 2017.
2017, right.
So and each of those judges are looking at it independently, so they're all agreeing.
Oh, that's important to point out.
It's not a rubber stamp, because the guy before me thought it was good, I'll just renew it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if anything, now it's a little bit harder for the FBI because they have to prove that the warrant was justified by it producing valuable information.
Oh.
So, and we can't tell as well from the reports from the document that was released, but the document does show that on each renewal, the FBI's information was longer. So it does sound like
every time they go back to a judge and they ask for the judge to grant them a warrant, they have to not only prove that he is still engaged in activities that prove suspicious, but they've also got to suggest to or very clearly point out to the judge that the stuff that came out from the previous warrants is also applicable here.
That's right. And there's additional information that comes about as they go through these renewals. So, for example, Carter Page has made so many different television appearances in which he has shifted his story, and then many times he actually categorically denies any meeting with Russian officials. In 2016, he said that to Judy Woodruff on PBS NewsHour. Yet he has testified himself before the House Intelligence Committee that he did have a private meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. And
anybody could do that, right?
Of course, yeah.
That's so easy.
Let's give him a call.
Yeah.
That's right.
What? Okay.
And he met with the Russian ambassador in the U.S., and he also met with the Deputy Prime Minister previously in July on his Moscow trip. So it starts to add up whereby the FBI would have every reason to say to the judges, what's he hiding? We need to continue this because obviously he's trying to say something about his activities that is untrue.
That's interesting. Ryan Goodman.